Two people wake at 7 a.m., work 9 to 5, and live in the same time zone. One earns more, sleeps better, and feels happier. The other is groggier, heavier, and 3% poorer, strictly because of where they live inside that time zone. Today, I'll show you which side of a time zone and which latitudes quietly make or break your sleep, mood, and yes, even your income. Chapter 1. Before the clocks. As I began traveling and living around the world, I noticed something unexpected. In some places, I functioned better. I felt more rested and well-aligned with the local schedule. In others, I functioned worse, struggling to fall asleep or get up in the morning. In some places, I slept less but felt more energized. In others, no matter how much I slept, I stayed drowsy and miserable. But why? The problems trace back to 1780, when the first factories in Great Britain introduced strict, fixed-hour shifts to optimize production. For most of history, we lived by the sun. But then, the clocks took over. With the spread of steam power, factories could run independently of daylight, unlike before when work ended at dusk. Urbanization followed, concentrating people in cities where daylight mattered less, and artificial lighting like oil lamps and gaslight extended waking hours. Today, the factory clock still rules our schools and workplaces, forcing millions to live out of sync with their biology. Compared to the pre-industrial era, few of us pay much attention to natural light cycles anymore. We live in a world of temporal mismatch. Our bodies still run on solar time, but our society runs on human-made mechanical time. That mismatch is the trap and the opportunity. Chapter 2. Time zones and happiness. Same time zone, 2 hours of sunlight before work in one city, 2 extra hours of sunlight after work in the other. Sounds the same, yet your biology doesn't agree. My varying energy levels around the world had nothing to do with typical traveler's jet lag. Instead, they were about the local light pattern and whether my natural circadian rhythms were aligned with it. In some places, like Barbados, my body was perfectly aligned with its sunrises and sunsets, making me feel healthy and happy. In others, like southern Spain, my body struggled to figure out when the day really started and when it ended. And here's where things get weird. Every time zone covers roughly 15 degrees of longitude, which translates to anywhere between about 830 kilometers, 515 miles, near 60 degrees latitude, and 1,670 kilometers, 1,037 miles at the equator. But in practice, political time zones don't follow the neat 1 hour standard. Some time zones can span thousands of kilometers, and some are narrowed, widened, or bent for convenience and borders. But what's the problem for us? Isn't that something only for geographers to study? Turns out that these time zones secretly influence how we live, and their impact may be much stronger than you think. Imagine that you live in Rzeszów, in eastern Poland, on the eastern edge of the Central European time zone. It's April 1st, and spring is slowly but surely awakening the world again. The sunrise is at 6:08 a.m., and the sun naturally wakes you up around 6:30 a.m., with plenty of time to get ready for your job at 9 a.m. Once your workday is finished at 5 p.m., you still have about 2 hours of natural light left, with sunset at 7:04 p.m. You're starting to get drowsy about 2 hours past sunset, and that's perfect, since you want to fall asleep no later than 10 p.m., so you can get 8 hours of sleep. Your circadian rhythms are aligned and your body is well suited for the local light pattern. Now let's fly 2,345 kilometers or 1,457 miles southwest to Vigo on the Galician coast of Spain, right on the Atlantic Ocean. We've gone 30.7 degrees west, crossing 2 full time zones in solar terms. Yet, surprise, we're still in the same time zone on the western edge of the Central European time zone, because Spain keeps Central European time for historical reasons. It's still April 1st, but while Rzeszów is just beginning to wake from winter, Vigo has already shaken it off and is deep into lush green spring. But all that fresh energy hasn't carried over into your life. The sunrise is at 8:17 a.m., and the sun most definitely does not wake you up at 6:30 a.m. to get ready for your job at 9 a.m. In fact, you wake up in complete darkness, hit snooze, begging for mercy, then drag yourself out of bed to get ready in the pitch black. The day only begins when you're commuting, drowsy behind the steering wheel, waiting for caffeine to kick in. If you work in a company that doesn't have a long lunch break in the middle of the day, as is often the case in Spain, You end your job at 5 p.m. There are still 4 hours of natural light left, with sunset at 9 p.m. Since the sunset is so late and your morning was so groggy, you decide to make up for that miserable first part of the day and stay up later too. You eat dinner at 9 p.m. and go on a walk through your neighborhood. With all that food in your stomach and bright street lamps, you don't feel like sleeping until 11:30 p.m. When you finally fall asleep, you barely sleep 7 hours. And the next day, you still have to get up for work in the dark. Your circadian rhythms are misaligned and you experience chronic, mild sleep deprivation. That's just one example of how a local time zone can affect your life. This isn't unique to Europe or early risers. It happens worldwide. In the most extreme cases, some truly bizarre things happen. For example, China keeps one time zone despite geographically spanning 5 time zones. Because of that, in the country's westernmost inhabited parts like Kashgar, solar noon happens around 3 p.m., while in theory, it should happen around noon. The clock says it's afternoon, yet according to the sun, it's barely midday. This also means strange summer days. On the longest days of the year, the sun rises only at 7:30 a.m., as if it were winter. Yet, it sets at 10:27 p.m., as if it were thousands of kilometers farther north. Let's now follow our east-west thread and see what kind of problems living on the wrong side of a time zone can cause. Chapter 3. The east-west difference. On the western side of any time zone, sunrise and sunset happen later than on the eastern side. On December 1st, sunrise in Pensacola, Florida, on the eastern fringe of the central time zone, is at 6:28 a.m. Meanwhile, the sun rises at 7:37 a.m. in Amarillo, Texas, in the same central time zone, but on the western fringe of that zone. Similarly, if sunset in Pensacola is at 4:47 p.m., it's at 5:35 p.m. in Amarillo. Sounds like no big deal. Yet this means that people in Amarillo often get up before sunrise to get to work on time, while people in Pensacola awaken with natural light. After all, both cities are in the same time zone, and a workday starts at the same time, regardless of sunrise and sunset times. Residents of Amarillo may have a harder time getting up when it's still dark outside, but they have no choice as their days are regulated by local clocks and not the sun. An Italian study published in the Journal of Health Economics in 2019 explores that problem. Scientists have observed that living on the wrong side of a time zone, that is, the westernmost edge of it, causes unexpected problems. The most notable of them is chronic mild sleep deprivation. Residents of Amarillo get 1 more hour of natural light in the evening. Sounds great. At least they can get outside after work since mornings are so dark, right? But that extra time in the evening, according to the study, reduces sleep duration by an average of 19 minutes among employed people. And that's an important point we'll address in a second. It also increases the likelihood of reporting insufficient sleep. Late light exposure suppresses melatonin, the hormone that triggers sleepiness, and makes it harder to fall asleep early enough for a full night's rest. Because remember, Amarillo residents don't get to shift their workdays to 1 hour later. They still live in the same time zone as Pensacola residents. Even if their sunrises come 1 hour later, this so-called social jet lag, or the mismatch between the biological clock and social schedule, may lead to some serious consequences. People on the western edge of a time zone in that study's sample slept less and more poorly. They were also 11% more likely to be overweight, which may later increase the risk of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. There was even an estimated 3% decrease in income among those living on the western side of a time zone. Yes, you heard that right. You may earn less money just because of your local time zone. That problem is caused by compounding cognitive and physiological effects of chronic sleep deprivation. 19 minutes a day is over 2 hours a week of lost sleep. That constant deficit reduces concentration, decreases motivation, impairs memory, and weakens immunity, increasing sick days per year. For optimal health and happiness, it's better to live on the eastern side of the time zone, where the sun rises and sets earlier. You'll wake up more easily with natural light, and you'll be more likely to go to sleep earlier, helping you stay healthier and happier. But there's a caveat. I've emphasized that it's the employed people who sleep on average 19 minutes less. People on the late sunset side of the time zone border are always more likely to go to bed later, regardless of their employment status. After all, you're unlikely to be sleepy when there's still light outside. But while the non-employed people who go to sleep later can simply wake up later, Employed people are less likely to adjust their waking time accordingly. They're forced to wake up before dawn, ending up with a misalignment between their biological clocks and their social obligations. If you have flexible mornings, retired, remote, self-employed, or unemployed, the negative effects of living on the wrong side of a time zone are largely neutralized. The harm comes from the mismatch, not the geography in itself. If you can wake, eat, and sleep when your body wants to, the local sunrise-sunset simply shifts your day. You can go to sleep later and wake up later, aligned with sunrise times in your local area. No problem here, apart from the fact you start the day later than others. And for night owls, having sunrise and sunset later is actually great. You don't want to be woken at 5 a.m. by a bright sunrise. And you're more active in the afternoon hours anyway, so that's when you'd rather have more light. But we don't live just in the eastern or western part of a time zone. We also live in its northern or southern part, and that affects our experience of time in a completely different way. Chapter 4. The North-South Difference. While the east-west position determines how our clocks align with the sun, the north-south position shapes how much daylight we get, and how that daylight shifts with the seasons. Or in other words, east and west determine when we see the sun, while north and south determine how long we see it. For example, Warsaw and Amsterdam lie roughly at the same mid-latitude of 52 degrees north, which you can imagine as being on the same horizontal line across Europe. This means that they have almost identical day lengths throughout the year. Since Amsterdam lies much farther to the west of Warsaw, it experiences sunrises and sunsets much later than in Warsaw. But you already know how this may impact your health and happiness. Now, imagine drawing a vertical line from Warsaw to Kiruna in northern Sweden. They're at almost the same longitude of 20-21 degrees east, with negligible east-west difference. But they differ rather substantially on the north-south line. On December 1st, sunrise in Warsaw is at 7:22 a.m., with sunset at 3:26 p.m. In Kiruna, due to its extreme northern location, sunrise is at 10:11 a.m., while sunset is at 12:44 p.m. And between December 11 and 31, the sun is down all day. This means that residents of Warsaw get 8 hours and 4 minutes of daylight on December 1st, while residents of Kiruna get only 2 hours and 33 minutes. But the situation reverses in the summer. Warsaw experiences 16 hours and 27 minutes of daylight, while the sun is up all day long in Kiruna. Warsaw's daylight varies between 7 hours and 42 minutes on the shortest day to 16 hours and 46 minutes on the longest day. So 9 hours and 4 minutes between seasons. Kiruna's daylight varies between 0 hours of daylight in the winter to 24 hours of daylight in the summer. Rather extreme, don't you think? And that seasonal variation is what we're dealing with across the north-south line. The closer you are to the equator, the more stable daylight is year-round. At the equator, days always start at 6 a.m. and end at 6 p.m. The farther from the equator you are, the more extreme your seasonal swings in daylight. Residents of Los Angeles get about 10 hours of daylight on the shortest winter days, and 14 hours and 25 minutes on the longest summer days. The seasonal difference is 4.5 hours. Meanwhile, residents of Vancouver, much farther north, have 8 hours and 11 minutes of daylight on the shortest winter days and 16 hours and 46 minutes on the longest summer days. That's a seasonal difference of 8.5 hours. For a more extreme example, Miami's seasonal difference of daylight is just 3 hours and 15 minutes. While Anchorage's is 14 hours and 7 minutes. In Florida, your daily rhythms can be roughly stable throughout the year. In Anchorage, it's close to impossible, with wild fluctuations between sunrise and sunset times in the winter compared to the summer. And the more extreme the seasonal swings are, the higher the likelihood of mood swings, circadian disruption, seasonal affective disorder, and vitamin D deficiency. Too little light in the winter causes sluggishness, fatigue, lower mood, and seasonal affective disorder, a type of depression related to changes in seasons. Too much light in the summer causes difficulty sleeping, restlessness, and potential irritability, since the body can't naturally switch off. And what does too little and too much mean? Having evolved in equatorial and subtropical regions, we're biologically designed for about 12 hours of daylight, but personal differences may change what too little and too much light mean for you. As I recounted in my video on the psychology of people who hate winter, linked in the description. I suffer from seasonal affective disorder. If I don't get enough natural light, as is the case in the winter in my home country of Poland, I feel depressed. I run on light, and I feel more energized the more light I get. It's hard for my body to get too much light. When I stayed in Finnish Lapland in June, there was no sunset. With 24 hours of daylight, I felt extremely energized and happy. My body had all the light it wanted, and then some. Sure, I found it harder to fall asleep with bright light outside even at midnight, but I felt infinitely better than in the winter. Meanwhile, my girlfriend doesn't suffer from SAD. She doesn't need as much light as I do. She also wakes up much later than I do. Consequently, she suffered from the worst jet lag of her life. Her body craved darkness, but it was never coming. For most people, stable daylight year-round, without wild swings, is the sweet spot. For optimal health and happiness, it's best to live closer to the equator, with no more than 4 hours of difference in daylight between winter and summer. It corresponds roughly to living within about 30 degrees of latitude north or south of the equator. Think Singapore, Bangkok, Dubai, Miami, or Brisbane. That's the biological comfort zone for light, where your circadian rhythms don't have to readjust dramatically with the seasons. Consistent daylight year-round helps fall asleep, sleep better, wake up more refreshed, and maintain steady energy levels throughout the year. But that's still not everything that you need to take into account when looking for the perfect time zone for happiness. There are still several factors that are often overlooked, yet that can cause dramatic differences in exposure to natural light. Chapter 5. Light environment. Even if you live in a perfect time zone, you may still suffer from social jet lag. But this time, it has nothing to do with the time zone in itself, but with some other not-so-obvious factors that influence your light environment. The first such factor is the presence of mountains, or rather, living in their shadow. When I visited Andorra, a small European country tucked between Spain and France, I was shocked by how dark it already felt in October. Even though the sun still rises and sets according to the clock and latitude, you only see it for part of that time because mountains block the horizon. So instead of 10 hours of daylight in November, you may get only 6 or less. Some towns located in deep valleys lose direct sunlight entirely from mid-fall to early spring. These shaded valleys often feel colder, dimmer, and psychologically heavier during the dark months. The skies may be bright blue above you, but you don't feel that because all around you, there's shade. For example, sunrise may be at 7:30 a.m., but you don't see it until 9:30 a.m. Similarly, sunset may be at 5:30 p.m., but the sun is already behind the mountains at 3:30 p.m. So effectively, your day starts at 9:30 a.m. and ends at 3:30 p.m., as if you lived much farther north. This doesn't apply just to Andorra. Any city that sits between mountains or in deep valleys experiences the same problem. For example, Telluride in Colorado is located in a deep, narrow canyon. The town gets little direct sunlight in the winter, keeping it colder and darker. Same goes for Anchorage, Alaska, where the nearby Chugach Mountains block the low morning sun, delaying first light for many neighborhoods by 30 to 90 minutes. Missoula, Montana, also experiences winters in the shadows. As residents note, the light goes from dark to gray to dark again in about 8 hours. And the problem with mountains isn't limited just to the winter. I remember staying in the summer in a cabin in Romania. It was located in a narrow valley by the river, with high mountains on either side of it. Despite staying there in June, it didn't feel like summer. The sunrise was delayed by 2.5 hours, and the sun hid behind the mountains 3 hours before sunset. Instead of having about 16 hours of daylight, it was just 10. In the same way, you get less natural light when you live in a forest or when your house is surrounded by any other tall objects, whether natural or man-made. Consistently cloudy weather is the second factor influencing the light environment. While our eyes still register natural light when there's no sun out, cloudy weather reduces natural light intensity by roughly a factor of 10. And even though that's still far, far brighter than indoor lighting, the biological impact on your circadian rhythms is significant. Consequently, in sunny regions, even the shortest winter days still provide more natural light and better mood regulation than longer days in cloudy areas. For example, one of the world's cloudiest cities, Tórshavn in the Faroe Islands, gets on average only 1,000 sunshine hours a year. with just 30 such hours in January and still a pitiful 135 in June. Even in the sunniest month, it still has less natural light than Valencia in southern Spain, which gets 158 sunshine hours in its darkest month. This is why Seattle, Washington feels much more miserable in the winter than Denver, Colorado, despite the former having milder winter temperatures. Seattle gets just 53 hours of sunlight in December, while Denver gets 196. But even a sunny place can still suffer from reduced light. The reason? Air pollution. Smog is, in essence, a man-made cloud. It reduces available light and impacts mood, while also wreaking havoc on physical health. Los Angeles and San Diego both enjoy over 3,000 hours of sunshine per year. But in LA, smog often dims and discolors that light, while San Diego's cleaner air keeps its bright days bright. Speaking of large metropolises and smog, we can't forget about yet another factor influencing the light environment. I'm talking about artificial light. LA's light pollution is so bad that its sky glow is visible from an airplane 200 miles, 320 kilometers away. Each time you step outside after dark in an excessively bright area, like downtown LA, your melatonin gets suppressed, which delays sleep and weakens your circadian rhythms. It's exactly the same mechanism as using your phone, watching TV, or sitting under a bright LED light past sunset. From the perspective of a healthy light environment, living in a small town or a rural area is better. Meanwhile, in cities that never sleep, your body often doesn't either. Surrounded by artificial brightness on the streets long after sunset, your brain keeps receiving the signal that it's still daytime, making deep rest more difficult. Hot weather is the last, not-so-obvious factor influencing the light environment. Residents of many hot countries stay indoors during the day, hidden behind shutters in cave-like apartments and houses. They only emerge when it's dark outside, flipping the natural rhythms. Healthy daylight exposure goes down, harmful nighttime light exposure goes up. And that leads to your body clock drifting later and later. Many Spaniards routinely eat at 9, 10, or even 11 p.m. and go to bed after midnight, even on work days. They often eat in restaurants well past dark and then come back home through light-flooded streets. In the end, they're more exposed to artificial light past sunset than natural light during the day. The same goes, to a lesser or more extreme degree, for southern Italy, Greece, Portugal, Argentina, Mexico, Turkey, tropical Southeast Asia, and Gulf countries. Our bodies don't like it when we start dinner past dark, when melatonin should already be rising and preparing us to rest. People who eat late often suffer from chronic sleep deprivation, metabolic stress, and hormonal imbalance. And that's the ultimate irony. Hot, sunny countries are full of daylight, but people's light exposure in those places is often more akin to that of someone living in a dark northern city. In the end, it's not just the amount of sunlight a place gets that matters, but how much of it actually reaches your eyes at the right time of day, and how much doesn't at the right time of day too. Keep the following 5 habits and you'll feel better, even if your time zone isn't ideal, than someone in a perfect time zone who ignores them. 1. Spend 10 to 20 minutes outdoors within an hour of waking, even under clouds. 2. Get outside during daylight hours, ideally engaging in physical activity. 3. Eat with the sun, finishing your last meal at least 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. 4. Keep your bedroom dark and avoid bright light at night to give your brain a sleep signal. 5. Keep consistent sleep-wake times to have stable circadian rhythms and a stable mood. What time zone are you in, and how does it affect you? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more videos on the geography of happiness.